The season had barely begun, and already Alara stood at the precipice of personal ruin. The candlelight of their modest townhouse cast flickering shadows upon the cracked plaster walls, where Lord Gavin's creditors knocked with increasing frequency. "Useless creature," he would mutter each evening, counting his losses at the card tables. "Can't even give me an heir to restore what your barren womb has cost me." She had learned to make herself small during these tirades, to press herself into corners and speak only when spoken to. The servants whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. Poor Lady Alara, married off to settle her dead father's debts, bound to a man who saw her as nothing more than a failed investment. Her only crime had been her inability to produce a son, though the physician had quietly suggested the fault might lie elsewhere. Gavin had dismissed him and never called for his services again. Tonight, something in her husband's manner set her nerves on edge. He paced the drawing room with manic energy, his eyes bright with the fever that always preceded his worst decisions. When he finally turned to her, his smile was the smile of a man who had found a solution to all his problems, and Alara felt ice crystallize in her veins. "Oh, astonishing, isn't it? But before we reveal how this incredible moment came to be, I have a question for you. Do you believe that destiny is written in the stars, or do we make it ourselves? Let me know in the comments below, and tell me, where in the world are you watching from today? I love reading you stories. Now, settle in, hit that subscribe button to join our family, and let me tell you the truth about what really happened. The fog rolled thick across the London docks that November night, swallowing the gas lamps whole until only pale halos remained suspended in the darkness. Alara stumbled from the carriage, her worn shoes catching on the uneven cobblestones as Lord Gavin's iron grip dug into her arm. She had asked no questions when he'd ordered her to dress and come with him. One learned quickly not to question Gavin when his eyes held that particular gleam of desperation. "Where are we going?" she whispered, pulling her thin shawl tighter against the river wind that carried the stench of fish and rot, of human waste and industrial smoke. The Thames lapped against the pilings below, invisible but present, its ancient voice whispering of things lost to its depths. He did not answer. Through the mist, a figure emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in black from head to toe. The stranger's face remained hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but Alara felt the weight of his gaze upon her, assessing, calculating. She had the terrible sensation of being measured and found wanting, though for what purpose she could not fathom. "Here she is," Gavin announced, his voice taking on the false heartiness he used with his gambling companions. He shoved Alara forward roughly, and she nearly fell. "Useless, but she can cook. She's yours for £500. The words struck her like a physical blow, each syllable a hammer against her ribs. Alara's knees buckled, and she grasped at Gavin's sleeve, her fingers clutching the fabric as her mind struggled to comprehend what was happening. "Gavin, what are you?" "Quiet." He backhanded her across the face, and she tasted blood, copper-bright on her tongue. Stars exploded behind her eyes. "You've been nothing but a drain on my resources. At least this way you'll be worth something. At least you'll finally have some value to someone." The stranger said nothing, merely withdrew a leather purse from his coat and tossed it to Gavin, who caught it with trembling hands and immediately began counting the coins with greedy fingers, his lips moving soundlessly as he tallied his salvation. "No!" Alara screamed, lunging toward her husband, but he sidestepped her easily, tucking the purse inside his jacket. "Please, Gavin, please don't do this. I'll work harder. I'll find a way to be useful. You'll do nothing," he sneered, his face ugly with contempt in the lamplight. "You never could. Barren and useless, that's all you've ever been. Your father saddled me with damaged goods, and now I'm finally rid of the burden." He turned on his heel and climbed back into the carriage, calling to the driver. His laughter echoed through the fog long after the horse's hooves had faded into the distance, leaving Alara alone with the stranger and the terrible understanding that she had just been sold like cattle at market, like a horse gone lame, like a piece of furniture no longer wanted. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. Alara remained on her knees on the cold, wet stones, her whole body shaking, unable to look at the man who now owned her. The fog pressed in close, muffling the sounds of the distant city, and she realized with crystalline clarity that she could disappear here and no one would know, no one would care, no one would even notice she was gone. Alara collapsed onto the wet cobblestones, her body racking with sobs that tore from her throat like physical things. She could not look at the man who now owned her, could not bear to see what cruelty awaited in his eyes. The stories whispered among the servants came flooding back. Tales of women sold to factories where they worked until their fingers bled, to brothels where they serviced men until they died of disease or despair, to men whose appetites ran toward the unspeakable and who discarded their victims in the Thames when they were done. "Please," she whispered, cowering as his shadow fell across her, blotting out what little light remained. "Please just make it quick. Don't let me suffer." But the blow she expected never came. Instead, she felt the weight of fine will settle across her shoulders. A gentleman's coat, still warm from his body, carrying the scent of tobacco and bergamot. She looked up in confusion, tears streaming down her face, to find the stranger kneeling before her in the muck and grime of the docks. His face finally visible in the lamplight. It was a hard face, weathered and stern, with lines around the eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy responsibilities. But his eyes, gray as the fog around them, held something she had not expected: pity. "I did not buy you to harm you," he said, his voice low and steady, the accent educated but not aristocratic. "I bought you to save you from him." Alara stared, unable to process his words. Her mind felt sluggish, shock wrapping around her thoughts like cotton wool. "I don't understand. My name is Nathaniel Thorne," he said, rising and offering her his hand. His palm was calloused, the hand of a man who worked, not merely directed others to work. "I have been watching Lord Gavin for some weeks now, following his movements through the gambling hells and debt collectors' offices. The man is a monster who was about to sell you to far worse than me, to men who would have used you until there was nothing left. I intervened before that could happen. Come. You are safe now, I give you my word." She took his hand because she had no other choice, and because something in his manner, a directness and honesty, suggested he spoke the truth. The carriage he led her to was fine but not ostentatious, well-maintained but practical, and when they left the docks behind, Alara found herself traveling not to some den of horror but north, toward the cleaner air of Bloomsbury where the wealthy merchants and professionals made their homes. The journey passed in silence. Alara huddled in Thorne's coat, watching the city transform from the industrial wasteland of the riverside to streets lined with respectable townhouses. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions but couldn't make her mouth form the words, couldn't push past the shock that had settled over her like ice. The Thorne estate, when they arrived, was unlike anything she had imagined. It was not a grand manor but a substantial townhouse that had clearly been modified for purposes beyond mere habitation. Every room seemed to pulse with industry. Here a table covered in mechanical drawings weighted down with calipers and protractors. There a workshop filled with half-assembled machines that gleamed copper and brass in the gaslight. The walls were lined not with portraits of ancestors but with patents and blueprints, diagrams of engines and railways and great steel structures reaching toward the sky. Models of bridges and buildings cluttered every surface, and through an open doorway she glimpsed a room that appeared to be entirely devoted to chemistry, with beakers and retorts arranged in neat rows. "What is this place?" she breathed, momentarily forgetting her fear in the face of such strangeness. "This," Thorne said, and something like pride crept into his voice, "is the future, and if you wish it, a new beginning for you as well. I will not keep you here against your will, but I can promise you safety, honest work, and the respect you deserve. The choice, Lady Alara, is entirely yours. The first weeks passed in a haze of confusion and cautious hope. Thorn asked nothing of her except that she help manage the household, and even provided her with a room of her own, a luxury she had not known even in her marriage, where Gavin had insisted she share his chambers so that he might more easily blame her for their lack of children. The room was small but clean, with a window overlooking a modest garden, and Alara found herself weeping the first night simply because it was hers, because she could lock the door and be alone with her thoughts. The household staff treated her with a kindness that confused her. Mrs. Pembroke, the housekeeper, was a stern woman who ran the house with military precision but who also brought Alara tea when she looked pale and never once asked about her past. The maids smiled at her in the hallways. The cook saved her the choicest portions at meals. It was as though she had stumbled into a different world, one where women were not automatically suspect or blamed for their circumstances. Alara threw herself into the work, desperate to prove her worth, to justify the strange mercy this man had shown her. She organized the linen closets and updated the household accounts, negotiated better prices with the tradesmen and implemented a more efficient system for managing supplies. It felt good to be useful, to exercise the mathematical mind her father had cultivated in her before his death and her hasty marriage to Gavin. It was while dusting the study one afternoon that she noticed the ledgers spread across Thorn's desk, columns of figures marching down the pages in neat rows. But something was wrong. Even from a distance, Alara could see where the numbers failed to balance, where an error in the accounts had cascaded through subsequent calculations, throwing off everything that followed. She tried to ignore it, tried to remember her place, but the wrongness of it nagged at her consciousness like a splinter under the skin. She should have left it alone. She should have remembered that she was there on sufferance, that Thorn had been kind but might not appreciate a former lady, now essentially a servant, presuming to correct his business affairs. But the error was so obvious, so fixable, and before she knew what she was doing, Alara had set down her cloth and picked up a pencil. The correction was simple, a transposed digit in the third column, throwing off everything that followed. She worked quickly, marking the error and noting the proper figures in the margin, then continuing down the page to correct all the subsequent calculations that had been affected. "What are you doing?" Alara spun to find Thorn standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable, his arms crossed over his chest. The pencil fell from her nerveless fingers, clattering against the desk. "I'm sorry," she stammered, backing away from the desk as though it might bite her. "I didn't mean to presume. I just saw that the numbers were wrong and I thought, I shouldn't have. Please forgive me." But Thorn didn't look angry. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his eyes fixed not on her but on the ledger, studying the corrections she had made with intense concentration. His finger traced the calculations, and slowly, very slowly, his expression shifted from surprise to something that looked almost like wonder. "You understand numbers?" he said, his voice quiet. "Where did you learn this?" "My father was a clerk for a shipping company," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. She twisted her hands together, waiting for condemnation. "Before he died, before I was married off to settle his debts. He taught me figures when I was young. Said it was a shame to waste a good mind just because I was a girl. Gavin said it was unnatural, that it made me unsuitable as a wife, that no man wanted a woman who was clever with numbers. He forbade me from ever touching his accounts." Thorn was silent for a long moment, his eyes moving between Alara and the ledger, his expression thoughtful. Then, to her utter astonishment, he pulled out the chair at his desk and gestured for her to sit. "Show me," he said simply. "Show me what else is wrong." And so she did. For hours they worked side by side as the afternoon faded into evening, Alara pointing out discrepancies and inefficiencies, while Thorn watched with growing amazement, occasionally asking questions that revealed his own sharp intelligence. She showed him how his bookkeeper had been categorizing certain expenses incorrectly, how the system for tracking materials was creating artificial shortages, how a simple reorganization of the accounts could provide much clearer insight into which aspects of the business were profitable and which were draining resources. When the clock struck midnight, Thorne finally leaned back in his chair and regarded her with an expression that held none of the contempt she had grown accustomed to in her marriage, none of the dismissive condescension that had characterized her interactions with Gavin. Instead, he looked at her as though seeing her for the first time, truly seeing her. "Miss Alara," he said slowly, carefully, "how would you like to help me manage the company finances? Not as a housekeeper, but as my partner in this enterprise. You are brilliant at this, more skilled than any bookkeeper I've employed, and I am in desperate need of someone I can trust. Someone who understands not just the numbers, but what they mean." Alara felt tears spring to her eyes, but for the first time in years, they were not tears of grief or shame or fear. They were tears of relief, of hope, of the strange and wonderful sensation of being valued for who she actually was rather than condemned for who she was not. "Yes," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Yes, I would like that very much." 5 years slipped by like a dream from which Alara never wished to wake, each day building upon the last until the woman she had been seemed like a character from someone else's story. The woman who had once cowered in rags now moved through the marble halls of Thorne and Company headquarters with quiet confidence, her silk skirts whispering against the polished floors like secrets. The business had tripled in size under their joint stewardship. Thorne's innovative designs for bridges and railways and industrial machinery, combined with Alara's financial acumen, had made them the talk of London's industrial circles, the upstart company that had revolutionized how modern engineering firms operated. "The Manchester contracts are ready for your signature," she said, entering Thorne's office without knocking. They had long since dispensed with such formalities, had evolved into a partnership where each anticipated the other's needs and thoughts with an ease that felt almost magical. She set the papers on his desk and moved to the window, gazing out over the city that had once seemed so hostile and now felt almost like home. From here she could see the Thames snaking through the heart of London, its waters carrying commerce and life, and she thought of the docks where she had nearly drowned in despair and marveled at how far she had traveled. Thorne rose from his chair and came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, smell the familiar scent of paper and ink and the machine oil that always clung faintly to his clothes. Somewhere along the way, the formal Miss Alara had become simply Alara, and the careful distance they had maintained had gradually dissolved into something warmer, something neither of them had quite dared to name, but which hummed between them like electricity through copper wire. "Do you remember the night we met?" he asked quietly, his eyes on the river below. "How could I forget? You saved my life." "No," Thorne said, turning to face her, and the intensity in his gray eyes made her breath catch. "You saved your own life. I merely gave you the opportunity, recognized what others were too blind to see. Everything that came after, every success, every innovation, every triumph, that was all you." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle, reverent. "You have made this company what it is. You have made me better than I was. I look at you and I see not the woman I rescued from the docks, but the woman who rescued herself, and perhaps rescued me as well, though I didn't know I needed saving." Alara felt her heart quicken, that treacherous organ that had learned to hope again despite everything. They had danced around this feeling for months now, both too cautious to acknowledge what had grown between them, both carrying too many scars to trust easily in anything as fragile as love. But standing here, with the afternoon sun painting everything gold, she found she no longer wished to hide behind professional courtesy and careful distance. "Nathaniel," she said softly, using his Christian name for the first time, tasting the intimacy of it on her tongue. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I love you," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Not as a business partner, though you are brilliant at that. Not as someone I saved, though I am grateful every day that I found you before worse men did. I love you as a man loves a woman, completely, hopelessly, eternally. I love your mind and your courage and the way you bite your lip when you're concentrating on a difficult calculation. I love that you rebuilt yourself from ashes and became something more magnificent than anyone imagined possible. The kiss, when it came, was everything Alara had never known she could want. Tender and passionate, careful and desperate. The meeting of two souls who had both been broken and had somehow found wholeness in each other. And when they finally drew apart, both of them smiling like fools, she realized that somewhere in the past 5 years she had become not what Gavin had tried to make her. Not even what Thorn had enabled her to be, but what she had always been meant to be, whole, valued, and entirely, magnificently herself. Lord Gavin had learned that rock bottom was not a destination but a journey, one that seemed to have no end, only ever deeper circles of degradation. The 500 pounds had lasted 3 weeks. A spectacular run at the tables in Mayfair followed by a more spectacular loss in a Whitechapel gambling hell where the other players had marked him for a fool from the moment he sat down. Then had come the loans from progressively shadier sources, each debt compounding upon the last, interest mounting like water rising in a sinking ship, until the day they came to collect not just money but blood. He had fled his townhouse in the dead of night, leaving behind everything except the clothes on his back and the crushing weight of his failures. The creditors had taken the house, the furniture, even his clothes, everything sold at auction for a fraction of its value. The months that followed had stripped away every last vestige of his former life. First his pride, then his dignity, and finally even his name, as he found himself sleeping in doorways and begging for scraps like any common vagrant. The other beggars gave him a wide berth, sensing something broken in him that went deeper than mere poverty, something rotten at the core. Winter came, and with it the specter of death that haunted every homeless soul in London. Gavin watched 2 men freeze to death in the alley where he sheltered, their bodies stiff by morning, and understood with perfect clarity that he would be next unless something changed. His hands had gone numb months ago, frostbitten fingers that barely functioned. His cough had developed an ominous rattle. He was dying by inches, and some part of him, the part that remembered being Lord Gavin, that remembered pride, welcomed it as a fitting end. It was in a gin house in Whitechapel, hunched over a cup of rotgut purchased with a halfpenny he had found in the gutter, that Gavin heard the name that made his blood run cold and his ruined heart stutter in his chest. Thorn and Company is hiring laborers. A man at the next table was saying to his companion, both of them rough-looking but employed, their clothes worn but clean. Good wages, they say. Fair treatment, too, none of that 16-hour-day nonsense. The place has gotten so big they need men for the new factory expansion in Southwark. Friend of mine works there, says it's the best job he's ever had. Gavin's hands began to shake, the gin sloshing in his cup. Thorn, the stranger who had bought Alara that night on the docks. For 5 years, Gavin had tried not to think about what had become of his useless wife, had told himself that she was probably dead or broken, that Thorn had used her and discarded her as such men did, that he, Gavin, had been right to rid himself of such a burden. The alternative was too terrible to contemplate because it would mean that he had thrown away something valuable, that the fault had always been his. But now, faced with his own destitution, the thought of steady work, any work, overrode his pride and his fear. Perhaps Thorn would not even remember him. Perhaps Alara was long gone, and no one need ever know the connection. Perhaps he could slip into the anonymity of the working masses and eke out whatever remained of his miserable existence with at least a roof over his head and food in his belly. The next morning, Gavin presented himself at the imposing limestone edifice of Thorn and Company, feeling small and dirty in the grand marble lobby. Clerks and businessmen strode past him with purpose, their shoes clicking on polished floors, and he saw himself reflected in a gilded mirror on the wall. A bent, gray creature in rags, nothing like the man who had once possessed a title and a townhouse, however hollow both had been. A clerk took his name, he gave a false one, Smith, the most common name he could think of, and told him to wait. So Gavin sat on a hard wooden bench, watching well-dressed businessmen stride past, and tried not to think about how far he had fallen from the man who had once owned servants and horses and a wife he had sold for £500. "Mr. Smith, the director will see you now." Gavin followed the secretary down a corridor paneled in rich mahogany, past offices where men bent over drafting tables and women worked at typewriters with the easy confidence of those whose presence was valued rather than merely tolerated. The impropriety of it would have scandalized him once, would have confirmed his belief that Thorne was some sort of radical whose business would surely fail. Now he was merely desperate, and if working for a man who employed women meant eating regularly, he would swallow his objections along with his pride. The director's office was at the end of the hall, its door bearing a bronze nameplate that read simply Chief Executive Officer. Not Managing Director or Chairman, but the American-style title that the modern companies favored, suggesting innovation and forward-thinking. The secretary knocked once and opened the door, gesturing for Gavin to enter. The office was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Thames, bookshelves lined with leather-bound volumes and engineering manuals, a desk of polished walnut that probably cost more than Gavin's townhouse had. Behind that desk sat a high-backed leather chair, currently facing away toward the windows, giving whoever occupied it a view of the river and the city beyond. "Mr. Smith," a woman's voice said, clear and cultured, the accent that of someone educated and refined. "Please sit." Gavin lowered himself into the chair across from the desk, confusion mixing with his anxiety. Why was a woman conducting interviews for factory labor? Perhaps she was a secretary, and the real director would arrive shortly. That must be it. Thorne probably had a female secretary, another indication of his questionable judgment. The chair began to turn. Time seemed to slow as the woman's profile came into view. First the elegant line of her neck, then the curve of her cheek, then finally her face, no longer gaunt and tired but luminous with health and confidence. She wore a gown of deep blue silk that must have cost a fortune. Her hair dressed fashionably in the style popular among wealthy ladies, a simple gold locket at her throat. But it was her eyes that struck him. No longer downcast and defeated, they met his with a level gaze that held no fear whatsoever, only the cold assessment of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. "Elara?" The name came out as a strangled gasp, his voice cracking on the syllables. "Lord Gavin," she replied coolly, leaning back in her chair with the ease of someone entirely comfortable with her power, with her place in the world. "Or should I say Mr. Smith?" The false name was a nice touch, though unnecessary. "I knew you were coming the moment you walked through our doors. I know every person who seeks employment here, review every application personally. Did you think I wouldn't recognize my own husband's name, even altered?" He could not breathe, could not think. His world tilted sickeningly on its axis as everything he had believed, every comfortable lie he had told himself for 5 years, shattered like glass. This woman, this polished, confident, clearly wealthy woman, could not possibly be the useless creature he had sold on the docks. "But you were useless. You couldn't, you had no—" "I was never useless, Gavin," Elara said, her voice sharp as a blade. "You were just too blind to see my value. Too stupid to recognize that what you called unnatural, my mind, my abilities, my talent with numbers, was precisely what made me invaluable. You sold me for £500 to pay your gambling debts. Do you know what this company is worth now? What I have helped build?" She leaned forward, her eyes boring into his. "More than you will see in 10 lifetimes. More than you can even imagine." The words struck Gavin like blows, each one stripping away another layer of the delusion he had maintained, exposing the raw truth beneath. His knees gave way and he found himself on the floor, no longer sitting in the chair but kneeling before the desk like a supplicant before a queen, like the beggar he had become. Pride was a luxury for those who had something left to lose, and Gavin had nothing. Nothing except the faint hope that this woman he had wronged might show him the mercy he had never shown her. "Please," he choked out, hating himself for the tears streaming down his face. for the desperation in his voice. "Alara, please. I made a mistake. I was desperate, I was foolish. But you must see." He grasped at the only argument he had left, the only thread that might connect his past self to her present success. "I made you who you are. If I hadn't sold you to Thorn, you would never have had this opportunity. In a way, you owe me." "She owes you nothing." The voice came from behind him, cold and final as a judge's sentence. Gavin turned to see Nathaniel Thorn standing in the doorway, his expression carved from stone, his eyes holding a contempt so pure it was almost physical. He crossed the room to stand beside Alara's chair, one hand resting protectively on her shoulder in a gesture that spoke volumes about their relationship, about the partnership they had forged. "She made herself?" Thorn continued, his voice low and dangerous, each word precisely chosen and delivered. "Every success, every triumph, every ounce of this company's worth. She earned it with her brilliance and her labor. You contributed nothing but the cruelty that forged her strength, and even that was inadvertent. For that, you deserve neither gratitude nor mercy. You deserve to be thrown into the street where you belong." Gavin looked between them, seeing the connection, the partnership, perhaps even love. Something deeper than romance, something built on mutual respect and shared achievement. He had thrown away a diamond thinking it was glass, had traded gold for copper, and now he was drowning while that diamond glittered beyond his reach, while that gold built empires he could never touch. "However," Alara said, and Gavin's head snapped back to face her, hope surging treacherously in his chest. "I am not without charity, though you showed me none. Thorn and Company does need laborers for the factory floor. The work is hard, 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. The pay is fair but modest. You will clean machinery, haul coal, scrub floors, whatever needs doing. The other workers will not know who you were, but they will quickly learn what you are, just another man trying to earn his bread." Her smile was knife-sharp, cutting. "Take it or leave it. But know this. If you accept, you will see me every day. You will watch me succeed while you scrub floors. You will understand, in the marrow of your bones, exactly what you threw away. That is the only payment I require." Pride warred with survival in Gavin's chest, each battling for dominance. Pride had already cost him everything. His home, his title, his dignity, nearly his life. Pride was a luxury he could no longer afford. Survival, at least, offered a roof and bread and the chance to live another day, even if that life was one of servitude and shame. "I'll take it," Gavin whispered, the words ashes in his mouth. "Good," Alara replied, her voice businesslike now, the emotion locked away behind professional courtesy. "You start Monday. The foreman will show you to the workers' entrance. That is not, I trust you understand, this entrance. This entrance is for those who have earned the right to walk through it. Now get out of my office, Mr. Smith. I have work to do." Gavin fled, and the sound of his footsteps echoing down the marble corridor was the sound of every sin coming home to roost, every cruelty finding its reckoning, every debt finally called due. The evening sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose as Alara and Nathaniel stood on the balcony of their townhouse in Mayfair, watching London spread out before them like a jeweled tapestry. From here, they could see the smokestacks of Thorn and Company in the distance, testament to everything they had built together, and beyond that the spires of churches and the dome of St. Paul's, the great city breathing and living and growing with each passing day. "Do you regret it?" Nathaniel asked quietly, his arm around her waist. "Offering him the job? You could have turned him away entirely. God knows he deserved it." Alara considered the question, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. "No," she said finally. "Let him see every single day what he threw away. Let him understand, in the marrow of his bones, that I was never the useless one, that the failure was always his blindness, his cruelty, his inability to see value when it stood right in front of him. That is a far better revenge than simply destroying him. Destruction would give him the martyrdom of being my victim. This way, he can only ever be his own. Nathaniel turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. For a moment he simply looked at her, his expression soft with an emotion that made her heart swell and her breath catch. 5 years they had worked side by side, and every day she found something new to admire in this man who had seen her worth when she could barely see it herself. "Alara," he said, his voice unsteady in a way she had never heard before. "We have been partners in business for 5 years now. In that time, you have become not just my closest colleague but my dearest friend, my confidant, the person I trust above all others. You are the first person I think of each morning and the last each night." He drew a breath, gathering courage. "I love you, not for what you have done for the company, though that has been extraordinary. Not for your brilliant mind, though I treasure it and the conversations we share. I love you for who you are, brave, kind, resilient, remarkable. You took the worst moment of your life and transformed it into triumph. You are my partner in business." He dropped to one knee, producing a small velvet box from his pocket. "Be my partner in life." The ring inside was a simple sapphire, clear and brilliant as a summer sky, set in gold so pure it seemed to capture and hold the dying light. Alara felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she pulled Nathaniel to his feet and kissed him with all the joy and hope and love she had found in these 5 extraordinary years, with all the gratitude for the life she had built from ruins and ashes. "Yes," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." They stood wrapped in each other's arms as the sun sank below the horizon and the gas lamps began to flicker to life across the city, each one a small star against the gathering darkness. Somewhere in that vast metropolis, a broken man settled onto a thin mattress in workers' barracks, contemplating the ruins of his choices and the future he had gambled away. But here, on this balcony, 2 people who had found each other in darkness now stood together in the light, proof that sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the doorways through which we find our truest selves. He sold her for a bag of silver, but she became the gold he could never reach. 10 years had passed since that night on the docks, and the seasons had turned the wheel of fortune with ruthless precision. In the workers' yard of the Thorn and Company factory in Southwark, a man with gray hair and bent shoulders swept coal dust from the loading platform, his movements slow and painful, his body broken by hard labor and the accumulation of years spent paying for sins that could never be fully redeemed. Lord Gavin, though no one called him that anymore, though even the name itself seemed like a joke from another lifetime, had aged beyond his years, his body twisted by the work that had become his penance and his prison. He paused in his sweeping as a carriage rattled past on the street beyond the factory gates, far finer than any he had owned even in his best days. The horses were matched bays, their coats gleaming with health, and the carriage itself was new, lacquered in deep blue with gold trim that caught the afternoon light. Through its window he caught a glimpse of a family, a man and a woman, elegant and content, with 2 children between them. The boy, perhaps 7, was laughing at something his father had said, his face bright with joy. The girl, younger, was nestled against her mother's side, a doll clutched in her small hands. The mother turned her head, and for just a moment, her eyes met Gavin's across the distance. Alara did not smile, did not acknowledge him beyond that brief glance, that flash of recognition. She simply turned back to her family, her hand finding her husband's, and the carriage rolled on toward whatever grand appointment awaited them, toward whatever life they had built together on the foundation of mutual respect and partnership. Gavin stood frozen, the broom forgotten in his hands, his heart a lead weight in his chest. 10 years of seeing her from a distance, 10 years of watching her move through the factory on her inspections, always polished and confident, always surrounded by people who valued her opinion and sought her guidance. 10 years of understanding, with increasing clarity, exactly what he had thrown away. He had not just sold a wife that night on the docks. He had sold his own future, traded it for £500 and 3 weeks of gambling. He had held a treasure and called it worthless, had cast aside the one person who might have made him better, who might have saved him from himself if he had only had the wisdom to see her value, to cherish what he had rather than mourning what he lacked. Value, he understood now, too late, far too late, is not what someone pays for you but what you believe you are worth. Alara had always known her worth, had carried it like a flame through darkness, even when everyone around her tried to extinguish it. And he, fool that he was, had never seen his own reflected in her light until it was gone, until he had become precisely what he had always accused her of being. Useless, broken, a burden on the world. The carriage disappeared around a corner, carrying away the life he might have lived if he had been a different man. A better man, someone capable of recognizing love and brilliance and loyalty when they were offered. Gavin picked up his broom and returned to his sweeping, because that was all that remained to him now. The cold floor, the coal dust that stained his lungs black, and the knowledge that he had gambled away not just money, but meaning itself, not just wealth but worth. In the carriage, Alara squeezed Nathaniel's hand and smiled at their children, content in the knowledge that she had never needed Gavin to define her worth. She had always been enough, even when no one else could see it. She had simply needed the chance to prove it to herself, and in doing so, had built a life richer than any title or inheritance could have provided. If you believe in knowing your own worth, no matter who tries to diminish it, remember Alara's story. Subscribe for more tales of those who found their strength in the darkest hours and emerged triumphant. The end. Dear viewer, what part of this journey touched your heart or surprised you today? If you'd enjoy more historical love stories filled with healing and hope, let me know below. Please like, subscribe, and share to help others find these stories too. Thank you for spending your precious time here. Your next beautiful story is waiting on the screen.